No, can we start, please? This is the last talk in this year's artist series that I run, and I am very pleased to welcome Tom McCarthy. Those of you who've heard of him will know his novel Remainder, which I think is a truly marvelous book, and it won in 2008 something called the Believer Book Award, which he says the more hip among you will know it's a hip West Coast thing. However, he then published another novel, Men in Space, and a third one, C, is
not out yet.
Due very shortly. Yes, will be out very soon. He also is part. Did you set it up? The Necronautical. All right. He's the founder of the International Necronautical Society, which is an ongoing art project, which I know nothing about. And the last thing I'll say about him before handing over to him is that Johan Grimmenpert's Double Take, which was shown as part of the London Film Festival last November, which is about, in some sense, about Hitchcock. It's called Double Take. Was taken from a story of Tom's, and there is a central monologue scripted by him. I also believe that Remainder is, well, they're trying to make it into a film. I think it should make an excellent film, but they're having difficulty. Okay, let me introduce Tom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Hear me okay at the back? Good. Okay, thanks, Parveen. I'm going to talk about 4 projects which are both separate and at the same time not really separate at all, since they're kind of dialoguing with each other and perhaps more importantly with other people's work. I'm kind of suspicious of artist talks because I think it's difficult for an artist of any type to really say what their work is about. Because that's not how you do it, is it? It's kind of, you don't say, I'm going to make work about this, and then you do it. It kind of happens differently. But anyhow, if there's a thread that connects these 4 projects, it's perhaps in keeping with the theme of Parveen's series. It's perhaps a relation they all have, even though they're primarily literary or perhaps visual art projects, a relation they all have in some way to film or to technological media in general. So the first project I want to talk about is called Greenwich Degree Zero, that I made in collaboration with Rod Dickinson in 2005. I guess it kind of illustrates a type of crossover territory that I often try to occupy. It is an installation piece that incorporates text, film, and objects. The backstory to it is that in 1894, this man, a French anarchist named Marshal Bourdin, he blew himself to pieces with a bomb that he was carrying just a few feet away from the Greenwich Observatory in southeast London. And it was generally assumed that he had been trying to blow up the observatory. And Joseph Conrad published in 1907 his novel The Secret Agent, which fictionalizes Bourdin's story and this whole episode. I grew up in Greenwich, and when I was about 16, 17 or so, through Conrad, I kind of became aware of the whole Bourdin incident. It struck me as a perfectly symbolic story, and in fact Greenwich struck me as a perfectly symbolic place in and of itself. It is the seat of time, the novelist's obsession. Time comes from Greenwich. It is transmitted around the world from Greenwich, and this is totally arbitrary, right? I mean, unlike the latitudinal division of the globe, in which the latitudinal division of the globe, in which the equator and the poles and so on are actually dictated by certain physical and magnetic and gravitational qualities of the Earth. Longitudinal lines are totally arbitrary. Zero could be anywhere. In fact, until the mid-19th century, it was in Paris, not in Greenwich, and Greenwich won it through some backdoor politicking. So it is utterly arbitrary. It is, in effect, a fiction. And it is literally written, inscribed on the ground. If you go to the observatory in Greenwich, there is a line cut into the ground, running past it and running all the way down through Greenwich. It is kind of another perfectly symbolic thing. It is a kind of an act of writing. So for me and for Rod Dickinson, when we made this project, I guess what really kind of sparked our whatever, tickled our fancy, caught our imagination about this whole episode is this sense that Marshal Bourdain's real target in his doomed act was not really the building. It was time. It was time itself. He was kind of trying to blow up time. And in that sense, he was a kind of artist of the impossible. This is kind of Conrad's line as well. Conrad shows him in these anarchist meetings just drawing endless circles, covering his paper by doodling circles, and Conrad calls it the symbolism of a mad art attempting the inconceivable. And of course, he didn't succeed in blowing up time. He just blew himself up. And in that sense, he becomes kind of Orphic, you know, this figure who is torn to pieces at the limit, at the border, at the very, you know, the degree zero. So when Roz and I started researching this whole this whole episode in order to make this piece, this multimedia installation, as we had to write to the Arts Council to fund it, while explaining how it would help the community as well. Mark Cousins will be glad to know. We what was really surprising was how the newspapers that reported it, they had wildly divergent accounts of what happened. I mean, they couldn't even agree on the date and the time, and I mean, they were so divergent. And then beyond the actual facts, the kind of speculation about why he did it ranged from conspiracy theories, which are actually very credible in this case, and that Conrad buys completely, through to all kinds of theories that he might not even have been trying to blow up the observatory. He might have been blah, 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 blah. So what's kind of interesting there is the sense that Bourdain kind of disappears twice, right? I mean, he disappears once, he disintegrates once with the bomb, and then he disappears again behind, or disintegrates again behind his own mediation. And so we kind of became fascinated with the event. I mean, not just this event, but the very notion of the event, or the relationship between an event and its mediation, or between the concept of the event and the idea of the kind of the mediation of an event. So we decided to take this event really to its absolute degree zero, to the point at which the suppressed event, the event that didn't actually quite happen, the event always in abeyance, as Blanchot would say, this event, to the point at which this event kind of happens. In other words, we decided to make Bourdain have blown up the observatory successfully, and have blown up time successfully, and we wanted to do this through the media itself. So what you see in this kind of installation shot is endless is many reproductions of the newspapers that reported it, but we've changed one word here and one word there. So instead of attempt, it's successful attempt. It's as though we make the observatory have blown up, and there's the clock on the left, and there's the bomb wrapped up on the right, and so on and so on. The centerpiece of the whole installation was this film. The most interesting thing we found while researching this was that the day after Bourdain blew himself to pieces, the Lumiere brothers premiered their new invention, cinema, to the public. Of course, it's just a complete coincidence, but actually it kind of isn't. It seems just so nice that the day after time is almost kind of fragmented and blown up. This medium comes along which is able to manipulate and cut and splice time, one of the earliest, I don't know if it's the Lumiere brothers one, but one of the very earliest kind of showcasings of cinema actually resulted in an explosion with the projector blowing up and injuring quite a lot of people. Anyhow, here is our film that we made on an old, I can't get that, here we go, on an old hand-cranked camera. Obviously we took it to Soho and dropped it, got a post-production house to drop in the flames afterwards. It's only about a minute long. A policeman's going to arrive in a minute, run and try and do something about it, while this bemused gent is just kind of standing more or less on the meridian, contemplating the death of time. There he goes. Oh yeah, I'll sort it out. Exactly. I don't know what he's going to do. Piss on it or something. No, there's a path that leads. It's easier if the path goes actually over the line. Years later, I saw a Japanese tourist puke on the very line. She came up the path and she threw up. It seemed like a kind of reenactment almost, this voiding on zero. She'd come halfway around the world, and it seemed it's unsurvivable crossing that line. When we first showed this, it was in 2005. My novel Remainder had just come out, initially with an art press, and then later with more mainstream, conventional literary presses. It's also, I guess, about the manipulation of time. There's a company in it, it's called Time Control UK, that's a kind of concierge company that will manage your time. But it's also kind of infused with a sense of the artificiality of everything, that everything is somehow a kind of fiction. The setup in Remainder is that the hero, whose name you never learn, has been in some kind of accident, he's undergone some kind of trauma. You never learn what that is either. But it has left him, like I did quite a lot of research into it, like many survivors of trauma, many people with what's now called PTSD and used to be called shell shock or whatever previously. But it's left him with a sense of inauthenticity, right? Only the traumatic event is real. Everything afterwards is just a charade. Many survivors of wars, train crashes, etc., have this syndrome. He feels inauthentic, and his sense of feeling inauthentic is initially expressed specifically or explicitly through a relationship to cinema. So I'll just read a short passage in which he kind of articulates this. He lives in Brixton. He's also had to relearn, he got some brain damage, he's had to relearn every movement, how to move, how to walk. So he can kind of do it all, but he feels like he's simulating doing everything instead of just doing it, as Nike would say. So, after I'd been out of hospital for a week or so, I went to the cinema with my friend Greg. We went to the Ritzy to see Mean Streets with Robert De Niro. Two things were strange about this. One was watching Moving Images. My memory had come back to me in Moving Images, as I mentioned earlier, like a film run in installments, a soap opera, one 5-year episode each week or so. It hadn't been particularly exciting. In fact, it had been quite mundane. I'd lain in bed and watched the episodes as they arrived. I'd had no control over what happened. It could have been another history, another set of actions and events, like when there's been a mix-up and you get the wrong holiday photos back from the chemists. I wouldn't have known or cared differently and would have accepted them the same. As I watched Mean Streets with Greg, I felt no lesser a degree of detachment and indifference, but no greater one either, even though the actions and events had nothing to do with me. The other thing that struck me as we watched the film was how perfect De Niro was. Every move he made, each gesture, was perfect, seamless. Whether it was lighting up a cigarette or opening a fridge door or just walking down the street, he seemed to execute the action perfectly, to live it, to merge with it, until he was it and it was him, and there was nothing in between. I commented on this to Greg as we walked back to my place. But the character's a loser, Greg said, and he messes everything up for all the other characters. That doesn't matter, I answered. He's natural when he does things, not artificial like me. He's flaccid, I'm plastic. This is a distinction that his physiotherapist has introduced, flaccid and plastic movement. De Niro's flaccid, I'm plastic. He's the plastic one, I think you'll find, said Greg, being stamped onto a piece of film and all that. I mean, you've got the bit above your eye, but that's not what I mean, I said. I'd had a small amount of plastic surgery on a scar above my right eye. I mean that he's relaxed, malleable. He flows into his movements, even the most basic ones. Opening fridge doors, lighting cigarettes. He doesn't have to think about them or understand them first. He doesn't have to think about them because he and they are one. Perfect, real. My movements are all fake, second-hand. You mean he's cool? All film stars are cool, said Greg. That's what films do to them. It's not about being cool, I told him. It's about just being. De Niro was just being. I can never do that now. Greg stopped in the middle of the pavement and turned to face me. Do you think you could before? He asked. Do you think I can? Do you think that anyone outside of films lights cigarettes or opens fridge doors like that? Think about it. The lighter doesn't spark first time you flip it. The first wisp of smoke gets in your eye and makes you wince. The fridge door catches and then rattles. Milk slops over. It happens to everyone. It's universal. Everything fucks up. You're not unusual. You know what you are? No, I said. What? You're just more usual than everyone else. I thought about that for a long time afterwards, that conversation. I decided Greg was right. I'd always been inauthentic. Even before the accident, if I'd been walking down the street just like De Niro, smoking a cigarette like him, and even if it had lit first try, I'd still be thinking, here I am, walking down the street, smoking a cigarette, like someone in a film. See? Second hand. The people in the films aren't thinking that. They're just doing their thing, real, not thinking anything. Recovering from the accident, learning to move and walk, understanding before I could act, all this just made me become even more what I'd always been anyway, added another layer of distance between me and the things I did. Greg was right, absolutely right. I wasn't unusual. I was more usual than most. A bit later, he has this kind of moment of deja vu, and he kind of remembers being in a building with a crack in his bathroom wall. And in this building, there's one neighbor is practicing the piano. Another neighbor is this old lady who fries liver, and someone else, someone else is hoovering, and so on and so on. He has this memory, and he can't quite place it. It might have happened. It might be like one of those Proustian memories that you kind of collage together from various other things, a bit of a real memory mixed with a bit of a painting or a book or a film, and so on. But what he knows is that in that building, whether it has happened or is to come, whatever time that is, when he's in that building, smelling the liver, listening to the piano music, and the hoovering and so on, he is authentic. And so he decides to spend the enormous sum of money he's received in accident compensation in constructing that kind of platonic, perfect building and occupying it. And he hires someone to play the piano, not to perform, but to practice and make mistakes and repeat. And he hires someone to fry liver constantly and someone else to hoover. And, of course, he needs an army of backup people with clipboards and walkie-talkies to make all this happen at the right time and backup people. In effect, he creates a massive film set, but with no film. And I'll just read the passage where he first puts his building into on mode so that he can kind of experience it and get this kick of authenticity. Naz is his kind of assistant who makes everything happen. There's other, Annie is another. There's various people that are his main backup people. So he's in the building. It's taken months to set everything up, and now is the moment. He has the most important memory, or non-memory he has, is of passing the liver lady, as he calls her, on the staircase, and she's putting out her rubbish, and he turns to face her, and she says something, and he replies something. He can't quite remember what, but that's the moment, that's the kind of ground zero of his kind of desire that he's trying to produce. Okay. Before phoning Naz, I stood alone in my living room for a while. The layout of the sofas and the coffee table, of the kitchen area, the plants, the counter and the fridge, all this was correct. Below me, I could hear radios and TV sets being switched on throughout the building. At least one Hoover was in use. I stepped into the bathroom and looked at the crack on the wall, just right, too. Not just the crack, but the whole room. Taps, wall, colours, crack, everything. Perfect. I stepped back into my living room, picked up the phone, and called Naz. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Good," he replied. He has a memory of cats as well en route, sorry. "Good," he replied. "I'll start the liver and the cats. We'll take it from there." "Fine," I said, and hung up. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out. Above the staggered, red-tiled rooftops of the facing building, the doors of 2 of the little roof cabins opened and 2 cats were shunted out of each. 3 of them started meandering slowly around the roofs, each in his own direction. The 4th just sat down and stayed still, although if I slightly moved my head a centimetre or so to the left, the kinked glass made him elongate and slither. A crackle came from downstairs, the snap of wet liver landing on hot oil. Then came another one, a 3rd, a 4th. For a few seconds it sounded as though fireworks were being let off a few streets away. Then the crackles quietened down into a constant sizzle, punctuated by the occasional pop. I wandered back into the bathroom and looked at the cats from there while I waited for the liver's smell to reach me. When it did, I stepped back into the living room and called Naz. "It's not right," I said. "What's not?" he asked. "That smell," I said. "I thought Annie had made sure they'd broken the pans in, so they weren't new, I mean." "I'll check that with her now," he said. "Hold on." I heard him radio Annie and repeat to her what I told him. I heard her radio crackle to his radio and back down the phone line to me. I heard her tell him, "They are broken in. We went through all this." "She says they are broken in," Naz told me. Then there was a crackle, and I heard Annie's voice ask Naz, "What's not right about the smell?" "What's wrong with it?" repeated Naz. "It's got that sharp edge," I told him, "kind of like cordite." "A bit like cordite," I heard him tell her. "That's what he said before," I heard her voice say. "Tell him to give it a few minutes. It should settle down once it gets cooking." "Give it a few minutes," Naz said. "It should—" "Yes, I heard," I told him. I hung up again and walked over to my kitchen area. The plants rustled in their baskets as I passed them, just like I'd first remembered them rustling. I went over to the window. The cats were widely dispersed now, black against the red. I could see 3 of them. The 4th must have slunk off behind a chimney pot. I brushed past the kitchen unit's waist-high edge, the same way I'd remembered brushing past it when I'd first remembered the whole building, turning half sideways and then back again. My movement wasn't deft enough, though, and my shirt caught slightly on the corner as I passed, not violently, snagging, but still staying against the wood for half a second too long, hugging it too thickly. This wasn't right, wasn't how I remembered it. My memory was of passing it deftly, letting the shirt brush the woodwork lightly, almost imperceptibly, like a matador's cape tickling a bull's horns. I tried it again. This time my shirt didn't touch the woodwork at all. I tried it a 3rd time, walking past the unit, turning sideways and then back again, trying to make my shirt brush fleetingly against the woodwork as I turned. This time I got the shirt bit right, but not the turning. It was difficult, this whole manoeuvre. I would need to practice. I moved over to the fridge and pulled the door towards me. The door gave without resistance, opening in a smooth and seamless flow. They've spent months getting the right type of rubber to let them do it. I closed it, then pulled it towards me again. Again, it opened smoothly. I did it a third time, again, faultless. Downstairs, the pianist was coming out of a corrective loop, speeding up as he took off for new territory. I opened the fridge faultlessly once more, then closed it for the last time. I was ready to go. I called Naz again. I'd like to leave my flat now, I told him. I'll walk down past the liver ladies. Okay, Naz said, count 30 seconds from now and then leave your door. Exactly 30 seconds. He hung up. I hung up too. I stood in the middle of my living room floor, counting 30 seconds, with my hands slightly raised, palms turned slightly outwards. Then I left my flat. Moving across the landing and down the staircase, I felt like an astronaut taking his first steps, humanity's first steps, across the surface of a previously untouched planet. I'd walked over this stretch 100 times before, of course, but it had been different then, just a floor. Now it was fired up, silently zinging with significance. Held beneath a light coat of sandy dust within a solid gel of tar, the flecks of gold and silver in the granite seemed to emit a kind of charge, as invisible as natural radiation, and just as potent. The non-ferrous metal banisters and the silk-black wooden rail above them glowed with a dark, unearthly energy that took up the floor's diminished sheen and multiplied its dark intensity. I turned to the first corner, glancing through its window as I moved. Light from the courtyard bent as it approached me. A long, thin kink travelled across the surface of the facing building, then shot off away to wrinkle more remote, outlying spaces. The red roof tiles were disappearing as I came down, eclipsed by their own underhang as the angle between us widened. Then I turned again, and the whole facade revolved away from me. I continued down the stairs. Sounds travelled to me, but these too were subject to anomalies of physics, to interference and distortion. The pianist's music ran, snagged and looped back on itself, first slowing down, then speeding up. The static crackle of the liver broke across the orphaned signals cast adrift from radio and television sets. The Hoover moaned on, sucking matter up into its vacuum. As I came within 4 steps of the 5th floor landing, I heard the liver lady's locks jiggle and click. Then her door opened and she moved out slowly, holding a small rubbish bag. She was wearing a light blue cardigan. Her hair was wrapped up in a headscarf. A few white, wiry strands were sprouting from its edges, standing out above her forehead like thin, sculpted snakes. She shuffled forward in her doorway. Then she stooped to set her bag down, holding her left hand to her back as she did this. She set the bag down carefully, then paused and, still stooped, turned her head to look up at me. Now, we'd spent ages practicing this moment. I'd showed her exactly how to stoop, the inclination of the shoulders, the path slowly carved through the air by her right hand as it led the bag round her legs and down to the ground. I told her to picture the root supporting arms on old gramophone players take, first across, then down. I showed her the way her left hand rested on her lower back above the hip, the middle finger pointing straight at the ground. We'd got all this down to a T, but we hadn't succeeded in working out the words she'd say to me. I'd racked my brains, but the exact line had never come. Rather than forcing it, or worse, just making any old phrase up, I decided to let her come up with a phrase. I told her not to concoct a sentence in advance, but rather to wait till the moment when I passed her on the staircase in the actual reenactment, the moment we were in right now, and to voice the words that sprung to mind just then. She did this now. Still stooped, her face turned towards mine. She released her grip on the bag and said, "Harder and harder to lift up." I froze. "Harder and harder to lift up," she'd said. I thought about this as I stood there facing her. Harder and harder to lift up. I liked it. It was very good. As she got older, her bag of rubbish was becoming harder and harder to lift up. She smiled at me, still slightly stooped. It felt just right, just as I'd imagined it. I stood still looking back at her and said, "Yes, every time." The words just came to me. I spoke them, then I moved on, turning into the next flight of stairs. For a few seconds I felt weightless, or at least differently weighted, light but dense at the same time. My body seemed to glide fluently and effortlessly through the atmosphere around it, gracefully, slowly, like a dancer through water. It felt very good. As I reached the third or fourth step of this new flight, though, this feeling dwindled. By the fifth or sixth one, it was gone. I stopped and turned around. The liver lady's head was disappearing back into her flat, and her hand was pulling the door to behind it. "Wait," I said. The door stopped closing, and the liver lady poked her head back out. She looked quite nervous. A noise came from behind her inside the flat. "That was excellent," I said. "I'd like to do it again." And he does. What he actually, the reason there were only 3 cats when there were 4 before is not that one is behind a chimney, but that it's fallen. In fact, the French title of this book is "Et ce sont les chats qui tombèrent," and it was the cats who fell. They can't find a word for remainder. There's an interview by Derrida where he just spends the whole interview talking about that word, reste, reliquat, remainder, how it's untranslatable, and it obviously wasn't in French. Anyhow, the cats are constantly falling off the roof, and his response to this is not a kind of humanitarian, sentimental, poor cats. It's like, well, get more cats. I don't care, you know, if you're losing 3 a day, get 4 a day. And this is kind of part of his sliding slide into, eventually he's doing the same with people without giving too much away. There's a move from kind of mundane reenactments to reenactments of crime and bank heists and shootings, and the reality stakes are kind of increased till by the end there's kind of blood all over the floor, and in fact all over the sky. So I guess, I mean, I'm not the critic, but if I was, I'd kind of say that I think something that's implicit in this book is the sense that, to come back to what I was talking about with Greenwich Degree Zero, that the event, its mediation, and violence are kind of inextricably linked. It's like a holy trinity. It's a triangle which is impossible to break. On perhaps we could add to that space, event, mediation, and violence. I just can't imagine thinking one without the other. I published a piece in the LRB just a couple of weeks ago, kind of trying to argue this, looking to Greek tragedy, in fact. The only thing that truly makes space meaningful and brings it into its own is the violent act, the murder of the father, the sacrifice of the children. For someone like Denis Ollier, it's the sacrifice of the king or queen or the animal. Anyhow, I'm digressing. Okay, I'm going to talk. How am I doing for time? I haven't got a clock on my computer because it's all. Oh, there's a clock over there. Fine, sorry. Okay, I'm going to talk about Double Take that Parveen mentioned very kindly in the introduction. This is really Johan Grimmenpretz's film, but we collaborated on it. I wrote the. It's not really the script. Johan, for those of you that don't know his work, is also someone whose work is very much concerned about the relationship between violence, mediation, space. I mean, the same kind of stuff. And And he made this wonderful film ages ago now, kind of in '94 or so, called Dial History, which takes the airline hijack, or rather television footage of airline hijacks, particularly in the 70s, when you had all these sexy Palestinian chicks, hijacking planes in high-heeled shoes, and it was suddenly very cool to be a terrorist, and so on. He takes this kind of situation of being in a hijacked plane with a relation to death and inevitably to the media, which if you survive it, you'll be able to get lots of money out of, and so on and so on. He takes this situation as a kind of exemplary model of what it is to be, I guess a Marxist would say, to be a subject under late capitalism, or perhaps in a more kind of Heideggerian way we could say as a model of kind of being in the world. The most exemplary situation, the situation that most exemplifies our being in the world is being in an airline hijack somehow. And in that film, he uses a very compelling text by Don DeLillo from Mao 2 that's kind of read intermittently as the kind of backbone of the film, in which DeLillo makes this argument that the novelist is now redundant because the terrorist has replaced him, whereas the novelist used to be the person that sums up the world, the state of the world, and changes it and makes a radical gesture that shocks and so on and so on. Now it's the terrorist that does that. The terrorist has more imagination. I mean, all these arguments were repeated, of course, after Sep 11 endlessly by everyone. But DeLillo, it's a very good essay. Anyhow, since Remainder ends in an airline hijack, I was very drawn to Johann's work, and he'd read the book, and I guess was kind of drawn to mine. And by the time we met, Johann was embarking on a new project which revolved around Hitchcock. And his crazy premise was that he had this notion that the history of the Cold War, and in particular with its logic of the double, right? So America and Russia double each other, capitalism and communism, Nixon and Khrushchev, and so on and so on. All these are it's a very literary logic. It's what you get in Jekyll and Hyde, or Frankenstein, or Caleb Williams, or Conrad, Secret Sharer. Everyone's written a double novel. Anyhow, Johann's idea was that the Cold War kind of situation of the double, who you are both fascinated with and hate and have to kill, or he'll kill you, that this could kind of be diffracted or filtered or understood through Hitchcock's obsession with the same theme. Hitchcock is obsessed with doubling, even more in his little TV skits he did than in his films. He has these things where there are suddenly two Hitchcocks and they're both saying, I'm the real one, no, I'm the real one, or one of them is a puppeteer and the other is being puppeted, and so on. Or there's an identity parade, and Hitchcock enters a Hitchcock lookalike contest and comes second, and so on and so on. So Hitchcock himself used to say that this is only his TV persona. He only looks fat on TV. In real life, he looks more like Cary Grant. So Johann had found this story by Borges, in which Borges meets his own double. A young Borges meets an older Borges. Actually, Borges wrote the story twice at different stages of his life. So first you have a young Borges meeting an older Borges, then you have an older Borges meeting an even older Borges. And he said, listen, look, here's this story. Why don't you do something with it, see what comes out? So I guess it kind of started as a kind of find and replace. Instead of Borges meeting Borges, we had Hitchcock meeting Hitchcock. They meet on the set of a film during a filming break. And then the issue becomes not just who is the real one, but whose film is this, right? I mean, the one who isn't real is going to be a character in someone else's film, in someone else's film set. The loser gets reduced to a character in the film directed by the winner. And in the passage that I'll screen a 6 or 7 minute clip of the film. The exchange that's coming up that I want to kind of flag up is the bit where young Hitchcock asks old Hitchcock who wins the Cold War. And old Hitchcock just brushes the question away and starts talking about how television is killing cinema. I think, again with my critic's hat on, the point being made is that it's the wrong question. Neither side wins. The thing that wins is, to use De Boer's term, the spectacle itself. Media wins. So would you like to roll the clip? That would be great. It's about 6 minutes.
which filled me, I can express in one word: joy.
We have scripted this moment together, my alter ego repeated. It was 1962.
Here we are. Here we are. That's a man's face. There it is. There it is. There is the first live television picture across the Atlantic. And now has it disappeared? Was that it?
But it is 1962, I told him. Certainly not, he replied. It's 1980. So tell me then, I asked, what's happened in the last 18 years of our lives? Well, that is in your past, which is now my future. Well, what can I tell you, he replied. The misfortunes you are already accustomed to will repeat themselves. In time, Benny, you will come to see that cinema merely confirms the old language. If we were successful, this was because we showed people what they recognized of themselves. Guilt, desire, anxiety, love, death, guilt. Above all, guilt.
The 39 Steps, The Lady Vanishes, Rebecca, Spellbound, Lifeboat, North by Northwest, The Birds.
Well, you know, Mr. Hitchcock put me through a suspense thriller. They built a cage for me, so they put me in a cage this time. And in the cage with me was the cameraman with live crows, which they alternately flew at me. And I was scratched many times and bitten. I had a good one right on the cheek right there.
Oh, I don't like blood at all. That's the funny thing about it, because he likes lots of blood. If I cut my finger, I'd fall over a fence. I had a bird on my finger for commercial in Munich. They had it on fishing wire, but it fell off my finger and it was hanging. So I found if I kept moving my hand, the bird would concentrate on not falling off, going like this. He was concentrating on keeping his balance rather than fly away.
Nature is there in its most fiercest. Now, the film shows that man takes nature for granted. But if it turns on him, then he's in trouble.
You will make the film we dreamed of for so long, he said. But in the end, you will realize that you have failed. That film was one of the roads that led me to this night. The others, the humiliation of old age, the conviction of having already lived each day, my words, which are now your present, will one day be but the vaguest memory of a dream. Equipped as ever with that fiendish sense of humor, he added, "Now this, Mr. Hitchcock, this is the film you will never make. The world will overtake you. History, sudden catastrophes, and global struggles will play themselves out in ways still stranger and more spectacular than your films. Tell me another thing, I said. Who wins the Cold War? He waved away the question as though it were trivial. Becoming more animated, he sat forward in his chair and told me half the movie theaters in the country have closed down. Television has killed cinema, broken it down into bite-sized chunks and swallowed it like birds devouring their own parent, I said. I knew I could trust myself to come up with a good simile, he chuckled. It is the destiny of every medium to be devoured by its offspring. And we too are not without fault in this. We helped hasten the new format's rise to power.
John F. Kennedy settles into office as the 35th President of the United States, the first president born in the 20th century. He comes to office after one of the narrowest elections in American history.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached.
Castro seized almost all United States property in Cuba.
That's good, thanks. Thanks a lot. The guy who looks like Hitchcock but isn't is this guy Johann Found, who's a professional Hitchcock double. He spent his whole life being Hitchcock. He actually died while the film was being made. Very Hitchcock, exactly. Okay, I'm going to end by reading from my forthcoming novel, C, which will be out later this year. I had the idea for it while I was doing an art project at the ICA years ago, kind of based around Jean Cocteau's film Orphée, in which the hero, for those of you that know it or don't know it, spends a good third of the film listening to the radio in his car, these short lines of poetry that he becomes fascinated by and repeats and retransmits. And they turn out to be transmitted originally by a dead poet in death, which is a landscape, a space, a topographic kind of territory. Anyhow, in my project, we kind of, I guess you could call it reprised, or not exactly reenacted this, but I set up a transmission center in the ICA where we listened to other media and kind of retransmitted it and sent it, it was transmitted over the radio and sent around the world to collaborating radio stations via the internet, who then retransmitted it on FM. Anyhow, while I was doing this project, I was kind of doing a lot of research into not just early radio, but early radio, but early communications, emergent communication technology in general. And one thing that kept coming back that I'm utterly convinced by is this link that all emergent comtechs have to death and to melancholia. I mean, this point has been made by others many times, by people like Avital Ronell in the Telephone Book and Haunted Media and so on, and so by Jeffrey Sconce and so on and so on. But it's really true. There's no communication technology that doesn't somehow have a relation to death and melancholia and practices of mourning. In this passage I'm going to read, it's not as long as the bit I read from Remainder. We have a young boy, 14-year-old, called Serge, in roughly 1909, 1910, 1911, listening, as many young boys did at the time, on a little cobbled together DIY radio set to the ether. And I guess, to return to this term that I kind of heaped scorn on earlier, I guess it's a kind of multimedia piece, in as much as there wasn't voiceover radio until about 1919, 1918. What you hear in 1910 or so is clicks, either long or short, so they represent Morse dots and dashes. So with the headphones, you hear clicks, you write on your paper, you write Morse on your paper, then underneath you write the words. So it's this kind of set of transferals from sound to code to text. And then, in my character, kind of has a film track running in his head from the images that he's kind of getting as he goes further and further up into the ether and further in space. William Burroughs used to say that when he writes, what he's actually doing is transcribing a film that's playing in his head. I guess in this passage it's the same, but exactly in reverse. It kind of, the film that it ends, the film track, that the image track that emerges is a kind of slow translation of text, and before that of code, and before that of primal sounds, kind of Rilken garage noise. And the second thing, very briefly, that I would just flag up before I read the passage is that I guess, again, this is a kind of critical point, but it is kind of quite blaring and maybe worth making. If it's read allegorically, maybe this passage could kind of be seen as a model for what an artist is or what an artist does, right? So Serge, my hero, if he's not an artist, but if he were, he would be an artist who is not a generator of the signal, but rather a receiver of it. This is exactly Cocteau's idea as well. The artist is not the originator, he's the receiver, the filterer, the remixer, and the kind of repeater. So he's in his bedroom listening to the radio, and then I'll stop when I finish this passage. The static is like the sound of thinking, not of any single person thinking, nor even a group thinking collectively. It's bigger than that, wider and more direct. It's like the sound of thought itself, its hum and rush. Each night when Serge drops in on it, it recoils with a wail, then rolls back in crackling waves that carry him away, all rudderless, until his finger, nudging at the dial, can get some traction on it all, some sort of leeway. The first stretches are angry, plaintive, sad, and always mute. It's not until, hunched over the potentiometer among fraying cords and soldered wires, his controlled breathing an extension of the frequency of air he's riding on, he gets the first quiet clicks that words start forming. First he jots down the signals as straight graphite lines, then below these he begins to transcribe curling letters, dim and grainy, in the arc-like light of his desktop. He's got 2 masts set up. There's a 22-foot pine one topped with 15 more feet of bamboo, all bolted to an oak stump base, half buried in the garden. The transmitter itself is made of standard brass, a 4-inch tapper arm keeping Serge's finger a safe distance from the spark gap. The spark gap flashes blue each time he taps. It makes a spitting noise, so loud he's had to build a silence box around his desk to isolate his little RX station from the sleeping household, or, as it becomes more obvious to him with every session, to maintain the little household's fantasy of isolation from the vast sea of transmission roaring all around it. Tonight, as on most nights, he starts out local, sweeping from 250 to 400 meters. It's the usual traffic, CQ signals from experimental wireless stations in Macedown and Ellery, tapping out their call signs and then slipping into Q code once another bug's responded. They exchange signal quality reports, compare equipment, inquire about variations in the weather and degrees of atmospheric interference. Serge moves up to 500 meters. Here are stronger, more decisive signals, coastal stations' call signs flung from towering masts. Poldhu is transmitting its weather report. A few nudges away, Malin, Cleethorpes, Nordyke send out theirs. Liverpool is exchanging messages with tugboats in the Mersey. Serge transcribes a rota of towing duties for tomorrow. Further out, the light ship Tongue is reporting a derelict's position, a wrecked ship. The coordinates click their way in to the Seaforth station, then flash out again to be acknowledged by Marconi operators of commercial liners, one after the other. The ship's names reel off in litany: Falaba, British Sun, Scania, Morea, Carmania, each name appendaged by its church, Cunard Line, Allen, Aberdeen Direct, Canadian Pacific Railway, Holland America. The clicks peter out, and Serge glances at the clock. It's half a minute before 1. A few seconds later, Paris's call sign comes on, FL for Eiffel. Serge taps his finger on the desktop to the rhythm of the huge tower's standby clicks, then holds it still and erect for the silent lull that always comes just before the time code. All the operators have gone silent. Boats, coastal stations, bugs, all waiting, like him, for the quarter-second dots to set the air, the world, time itself back in motion as they chime the hour. They sound, and then the headphones really come to life. The press digest goes out from Niton, Poldu, Malin, Cadiz, Diario del Atlántico, Journal de l'Atlantique, Atlantic Daily News, Madero and Suarez shot in Mexico while trying to escape, trade pact between Entretien de shocking domestic tragedy in Beau, Il Fondatore, husband unable to prevent. The stories blur together. Serge sees a man clutching a kitchen knife, chasing a politician across parched earth, past cacti and armadillos, while ambassadors wave papers around fugitive and pursuer, negotiating terms. Grain up 5, Lloyd's down 2, Australia all out for 421, England 62 for 3 in reply. Malin has got 10 private messages for Lusitania, 7 for Campania, 2 for Olympic. Request instructions how to proceed with the honour of your company on the occasion of weighing 7.5 pounds, a girl. The operators stay on after the Marconigrams have gone through, chatting to one another. Carrigan has moved to President Lincoln, Borstaball to Malois, the company football team drew 2-2 against the Evening Standard 11. Old Alsop, wireless instructor at Marconi House, is getting married on the 22nd. His tapper finger firing up her spark gap. Short, then long. Olympic and Campania are playing a game of chess, K4 to Q7, K4 to K5. They always start K4. Serge transcribes for a while, then lays his pencil down and lets the sequences run through the space between his ears, sounding his skull. There's a fluency to them, a rhythm that's spontaneous, as though the clicks were somehow speaking on their own and didn't need the detectors, keys, or finger-twitching men who cling to them like afterthoughts. He climbs up to 600 and picks up ice reports sent out from whalers. Floberg, Growler, 23 degrees west, 37 degrees north. Field ice, 24 degrees west, 36 degrees north. Compagnie de Télégraphie Sans Fil reports occasional light snow off Friesland. Paris comes on again. Again the cycle pauses and restarts. Then Bergen, Crookhaven, Tarifa, Malaga, Gibraltar. Serge pictures gardenias tucked behind girls' ears, red dresses and the blood of bulls. He hears news forwarded via Port Said in Rome from Abyssinia and sees an African girl strumming on some kind of mandolin, jet black breasts glowing darkly through light silk. Suez is issuing warnings of Somali raiders further down the coast. More names process by: Isle of Perim, Zanzibar, Isle of Socotra, Persian Gulf. Parades of tents line themselves up for him. Inside them, dancers serving sherbet. Outside, camels saddled with rich carpets. Deserts opening up beneath red skies. The air is rich tonight, still and cold, high pressure, the best time of year. He lets a fart slip from his buttocks and waits for its vapor to reach his nostrils. It too carries signals, odor messages from distant, unseen bowels. When it arrives, he slips the headphones off, opens the silent cabin's door to let some air in, and hears a goods train passing half a mile away. The pulsing of its carriage joins above the steel rails carries to him cleanly. He looks down at his desk, the half-worn pencil, the light's edge across the paper sheet, the tuning box, the tapper. These things, here, solid, tangible, are somehow made more present by the tinny sound still spilling from the headphones lying beside them. The sound is present too, material. Serge sees its ripples snaking through the sky, pleats in its fabric, joins pulsing as they make their way down corridors of air and moisture, rock and metal, oak, pine, and bamboo. Above 650, the clicks dissipate into a thin, pervasive noise, like dust. Discharges break across this, distant lightning, aurora borealis, meteorites. Their crashes and eruptions sound like handfuls of buckshot thrown into a tin bucket, or a bucket full of grain-rich gravy dashed against a wash boiler. Wireless ghosts come and go, moving in arpeggios that loop, repeat, mutate, then disappear. Serge spends the last half hour or so of each night up here among these pitches, nestling in their contours as his head nods towards the desktop and lights flash across the inside of his eyelids, pushing them outwards from the center of his brain, so far out that the distance to their screen seems infinite. They seem to contain all distances, to envelop space itself, curving around it like a patina, a mold. Once he picked up a CQD, a distress signal. It came from the Atlantic, 200 or so miles off Greenland. The Pachitea, merchant vessel of the Peruvian steamship company, had hit an object, maybe whale, maybe iceberg, and was breaking up. The nearest vessel was another South American, Acania, but it was 50 miles away. Galway had picked the call up, so had Le Havre, Malin, Poldhu, and just about every ship between Southampton and New York. 15 minutes after Serge had locked onto the signal, half the radio bugs in Europe had tuned into it as well. The Admiralty put a message out instructing amateurs to stop blocking the air. Serge ignored the order but lost the signal beneath general interference. The atmospherics were atrocious that night. He listened to the whine and crackle, though, right through till morning, and heard, or thought he heard, among its breaks and flecks, the sound of people treading cold, black water, their hands beating small disturbances into waves that had come to bury them. And I'll stop. Thanks.
Marvelously.
Sorry, it's so long, but you have to read a bit of a stretch to get a sense of
no,
the...
it was quite wonderful. Would people like to comment or respond in some way?
I think having spent a lot of time at sea, that is exactly what the Radio Shack was like.
So, expand, please.
You had this pervasive, you had not just the messages that the radio officer was listening to, but every other message that was in the ether at that time. Yeah. They were all there, and you would zone in on the one you wanted. And the 2 minutes on the hour, everyone had to get off the air for the CQDs and things like that. And it was very atmospheric. It was very, very accurate. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, thank you. I just, I mean, obviously I did a lot of research. I've learned to set all future novels in London in 2010 because it just takes ages to, but what was really interesting is yeah, the amount of chatter. I mean, it's just like the internet. They play chess. All the Marconi operators on the ships are men, and many of the on the shore are women, and they flirt. You know, there were marriages that came out of it, unlike internet ones that didn't really work, but once you're in proximity, it's not the same. Anyhow, the kind of, yeah, it seemed like they're charged with just general, I mean, what really, what interests, this book starts in about 1898 when Marconi is first experimenting and ends in 22, which is the year that the BBC sets up, the BBC is born. In other words, all this anarchic, chaotic cacophony of the air is brought under one regulated state authority and becomes propaganda. But it's also the great year of literary modernism. It's the year that Ulysses is written, and The Wasteland. And The Wasteland in particular is basically a radio poem. I mean, voices, exactly what you're describing, voices drop in and out, there's cross interference, you lose a signal, you get it again. You know, it's also the year that Tutankhamun is discovered, this great kind of death situation that suddenly absolutely captures the imagination of everyone in Europe in a weird way. They seem to kind of go together. But
you want to put on your critic's mode and say something more about the connections that you were positing between space, event, and death. I mean, death comes in narratively, even in the short passage you read out. But how do you actually conceive that relation?
Well, when I was kind of, you know, I mean, one is always learning, but when I was kind of trying to learn to write something at all, I was really into Alain Robbe-Grillet, the leader of the Nouveau Roman school, and his novels are very topographic. In fact, even to understand what the fuck was going on in them, I had to draw like diagrams, maps of the ground plan and the space. And some people say Alain Robbe-Grillet is really boring. Like Houellebecq says, it's like land surveying or soil cutting. And he's kind of, I mean, he's completely wrong. But in a way, he would be right were there not the violent event. At the heart of Robbe-Grillet's kind of topographic exercises, there's always a murder, some violent scene, and this kind of concentrates the space and makes it mean something. Otherwise, it is just surveying meaningless space. And I don't know, I guess that logic kind of stuck with me. So in Remainder, he's doing all these exercises of recreating a space, manipulating it, repeating, multiplying it, but at the heart of it is the traumatic event, the violent event, and it seems to me that it would kind of be boring if there weren't that. Like, what would the point be? You know?
In C.
In C, it's the whole book. It's an incest novel basically. The sister's death is the violent event. She goes schizophrenic and dies into radio. She becomes like a dispersed signal, and then there's all this Isis and Osiris stuff about recombining and so on. So yeah, there's always trauma. I mean, for Freud, we only become subjects through trauma. Ultimately, for the late Freud, trauma becomes everything, is the bedrock of our subjectivity, and I buy that completely. I think that's I believe it.
Any more questions?
That's Rod Dickinson, who I did Greenwich Degree Zero with. There's going to be a hostile question. I can see it warming.
Yeah, it's a cheat me asking you a question. You've spoken in the past. I didn't hear the beginning of this lecture, but in the past you've spoken a lot.
I was saying how great you were at the beginning.
About the relationship between art and literature, and your activities as a novelist, I think, stem at least partially through your critique of contemporary literature and the way in which you found a kind of home for yourself within art practice that you found more open and more engaging and more curious and possibly more informed as well. And it's evident, the progress of that relationship in your work is evident, and I've no doubt that it was evident in this lecture in the bits that I didn't see. And I just wonder, is there a moment, can you imagine, when that progress will sort of reverse itself, or there'll be a sort of reciprocation of your literature back into artwork in some way, or your art practices?
I mean, yeah, it's odd, isn't it? Because I mean, what I found, when I wrote Remainder, I mean, I had an agent and everything, it was given to all the big presses, and none of them would touch it. Most of them simply didn't get it. Like, they'd say, why is he just repeating all this stuff? And I'd say, well, haven't you read Beckett? And they'd go, no. You know? And the few that did, the few editors that did, kind of said, look, I have, but the people who are actually going to allow me to publish this haven't, so we just can't do it. Of course, in the art world, everyone has read Beckett, and Burroughs and Kafka and Faulkner. I mean, the art world is, generally speaking, much more literate than the literary world, bizarrely. And lots of people, lots of artists' work is very informed by literature. And then Remainder was first published by an art press, by Clementine Delis's Metronome, which was itself a kind of reenactment. She discovered Girodias's Olympia Press from the 50s that published Burroughs, Beckett, Trocky, Nabokov, people that mainstream presses wouldn't touch, and did it in this kind of weird way. And so she made her books kind of look like the Olympia Press ones typographically, and distributed it only through the art world. And then with Remainder, because it is so kind of obviously literary, it's so riffing off lots of modernist writers, the literary press picked it up and started, you know, writing nice things about it. And then of course the same publishers come back and say, no, we do want it after all. But of course I didn't want them or to work with them at that point. And then Vintage took it in New York, and it was actually on the bestseller list for like 5 minutes, but you know, a week, whatever. And so it kind of, you know, I've seen both ends. I mean, now I feel very, you know, the Sea is coming out with Jonathan Cape, who have a new, young, very literate editor, you know, and with Knopf in America. So I do feel kind of quite, you know, I don't feel like an outsider in that mainstream publishing world anymore. But, I mean, to answer your question, sorry, it's a real ramble, but to answer your question, I mean, I guess always, if you look back in history, most of the most dynamic cultural kind of things have occupied an interzone. Think of futurism. I mean, it's kind of painting meets film meets politics, very dodgy politics, meets, you know, or surrealism, or later, someone like Edmond Jabez or even Derrida, you know, some of Derrida is kind of fiction. Half the postcard is fiction, you know, or uses that mode, and I think this kind of slippage is always very interesting and very productive, and long may it continue. But maybe in 20 years the art world will be totally boring, commercial and institutional, seriously, and filmmaking will be the place where it becomes a refugee. I feel the art world is like this massive life raft, and everyone has jumped in there. Half the successful artists now didn't train as artists, they trained as philosophers or writers or whatever, and that's a great thing. There are many problems with art and the art world, but that's a great thing about it. But it might not always be that way. But hopefully there'll always be a life raft sometime.
It seems to me that the two passages that you read out were almost running in the opposite direction. That one was seemed to be about somebody who was trying to construct the moment, the present moment, and nothing but the present moment in the imminence of what was physically in front of him. And the other was somehow going through the present moment to a continuous and simultaneous beyond, everywhere, a sort of ubiquity that was on the other side of the radio apparatus.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what this amounts to. The first one I was put in mind of, it seemed to me the opposite almost of the story by Borges called Funes de Memorias. Funes also suffers a disaster, a trauma. He falls over and the bang on his head produces a complete ability to remember everything, every single thing that he sees. And he ends up wanting to escape from that, and he constructs blackness every night. And it's as if you described the opposite of Funes in some kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that story. I mean, it's another Borges story called Pierre Menard, where somebody writes Don Quixote in Nîmes, in the south of France, word for word the same, and he is adamant that it is not the same because it's a different event. But there's this kind of logic of repetition, and I guess maybe what those two passages and the two books share in common is a logic of repetition. So, you know, the hero of Remainder or the hero of C, they're both kind of, repeating. They are in a kind of passive space, even as they're most active, even as the guy in Remainder is saying, do this, do that, stop, do it again. He's being kind of radically passive in as much as he's letting himself become a puppet manipulated by some past or future or some other space, time thing. And I guess it's the same in C at a more kind of linguistic level, or phenomenological. You know, he's a hollow chamber where other spaces and times are coming in and being repeated through him. So does that make sense?
Your passage from C reminded me of the double take.
Right. The melancholia, or?
No, it's really something Brian was saying about how those two passages worked in opposite directions, and it just seemed to me that it was what you've just described as the central figure in C being subject to this incoming stuff. In a sense, the film does that to us.
Yeah.
You know, it is exactly that, everything coming
Oh yeah,
at us.
It's a cut-up. It's a mission.
Yes, and that is different from Remainder. I mean, I'm not sure how significant that is, but Remainder doesn't work in that fashion.
No, in Remainder, he's trying to make a coherent kind of natural. He's a reactionary in that sense. He's trying to make a naturalist narrative out of all these fragments that he's putting together. Whereas in C, he's disintegrating into the fragments. He's much more avant-garde, the guy in C. He's not a regressive.
Does that satisfy you, Brian, as an answer? Yes, I think.
Yeah.
Just adding on to what was just said, it's a long time since I read that, but doesn't Funes, after the blackness, doesn't he descend into this kind of radical solipsistic splitting where he tries to make a language system where the correlative for the letter A is a red horse at dawn at 3:15 a.m. on a given date. And so he just creates this enormous, utterly schizophrenic system and descends into the chaos of that. So it sounds a bit like the character you were talking about. But I wanted to think a little bit about Remainder. And in fact, like our friend Matt Parker, who was always talking back in the days when you were writing Remainder about, he was going on these sort of screenwriting stories, courses and things, and talking about three-act structure. And I mean, it strikes me that the trajectory of Remainder, it basically runs along those lines as far, if you think of, as I understand this stuff, it's like, like North by Northwest or whatever, where you have the sort of initial setup, then you have some extraordinary incident, and then escalating tension and different iterations, and men chasing after you with guns. But you have those rising escalations of the different reenactments, and then the climax. I mean, do you think was that classic filmic structure? Does it inform Remainder?
I'm sure it does. I mean, it was just intuitive. I just had the idea for the book. I saw a crack in the wall at a party where I was not entirely sober, and had this moment of deja vu and thought, oh, I'll do an art project and reconstruct the space. But then I kind of thought, no, that's boring unless you can actually escalate it to the point of having people killing each other. So then it has to be a novel or a massive crime spree. So I didn't really think, what's the narrative structure? It just kind of came in half an hour, and I scrawled it down on an envelope. But I'm sure. But we are informed by that. Our subjectivity is totally informed by media. There is no. I mean, this is where the guy in Remainder is so wrong. But it's sweet, that he thinks there is an authenticity beyond film, which is exemplified by De Niro in a film. you know, it's completely wrong. But it's the same as Don Quixote has. In books, these guys are real, so I've got to do exactly what Don Belianos of Greece does on page 320. Yeah, he literally reenacts it. But with the escalation thing, I mean, I guess in Remainder it's more blatantly repetitive than a classical arc. I was thinking there's a really good kind of novel, anti-novel novel by Pierre Albert Birot called Grabinola that has no paragraph breaks, no punctuation. But anyhow, there's this one episode where he sees that his on his mantelpiece there's like a clock or something that's not straight, and he tries to write it, and he realizes the mantelpiece isn't straight, and he tries to, you know, wedge it up, and then he realizes the floorboards aren't straight, so he goes underneath. Then he realizes the house foundations, so he digs down. Then it's the street itself, and then it's his country. So by the end, he's putting Semtex or whatever, dynamite, on the San Andreas fault or whatever the European equivalent is, and causing earthquakes. But it's only 4 very simple escalations of the same thing, from trying to straighten a clock to causing global catastrophe. It's amazing how quickly you can escalate and how satisfying that logic is. You know, so yeah. No, just what I read. I mean, you know, they have all these wonderful magazines in the British Library, like Wireless World, going back to 1911, and you can just read all these accounts. I went to the Radio Museum up in Potter's Bar or somewhere, and the kind archivist, who himself was one of those kids back in the day, not in 1911, but, you know, talked me through and showed me all these manuals of transcripts. So, no, it's all totally... thank you. Thank you very much. Part of the machine, yeah. Yeah. Human becomes the filterer, the untangler, yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for having me.